The Labours of Hercules by Agatha Christie. Episode 5. The Augean Stables. Read by Beau McKenna. The situation is an extremely delicate one, Monsieur Poirot. A faint smile flitted across Hercule Poirot's lips. He almost replied, "It always is." Instead, he composed his face and put on what might be described as a bedside manner of extreme discretion. Sir George Conway proceeded weightily. Phrases fell easily from his lips. The extreme delicacy of the government's position, the interests of the public, the solidarity of the party, the necessity of presenting a united front, power of the press, the welfare of the country. It all sounded well, and meant nothing. Hercule Poirot felt that familiar aching of the jaw when one longs to yawn and politeness forbids. He had felt the same sometimes when reading the parliamentary debates, but on those occasions there had been no need to restrain his yawns. He steeled himself to endure patiently. He felt at the same time a sympathy for Sir George Conway. The man obviously wanted to tell him something, and as obviously had lost the art of simple narration. Words had become to him a means of obscuring facts, not of revealing them. He was an adept in the art of the useful phrase, that is to say, the phrase that falls soothingly on the ear and is quite empty of meaning. The words rolled on. Poor Sir George became quite red in the face. He shot a desperate glance at the other man sitting at the head of the table, and the other man responded. Edward Ferrier said, "All right, George. I'll tell him." Hercule Poirot shifted his gaze from the Home Secretary to the Prime Minister. He felt a keen interest in Edward Ferrier, an interest aroused by a chance phrase from an old man of 82. Professor Fergus MacLeod, after disposing of a chemical difficulty in the conviction of a murderer, had touched for a moment on politics. On the retirement of the famous and beloved John Hammett, now Lord Cornworthy, his son-in-law Edward Ferrier had been asked to form a cabinet. As politicians go, he was a young man, under 50. Professor MacLeod had said, "Ferrier was once one of my students. He's a sound man." That was all, but to Hercule Poirot it represented a good deal. If MacLeod called a man sound, it was a testimonial to character compared with which no popular or press enthusiasm counted at all. It coincided, it was true, with the popular estimate. Edward Ferrier was considered sound. Just that. Not brilliant, not great, not a particularly eloquent orator, not a man of deep learning. He was a sound man, a man bred in the tradition, a man who had married John Hammett's daughter, who had been John Hammett's right-hand man, and who could be trusted to carry on the government of the country in the John Hammett tradition. For John Hammett was particularly dear to the people and press of England. He represented every quality which was dear to Englishmen. People said of him, "One does feel that Hammett's honest." Anecdotes were told of his simple home life, of his fondness for gardening. Corresponding to Baldwin's pipe and Chamberlain's umbrella, there was John Hammett's raincoat. He always carried it. A weather-worn garment, it stood as a symbol of the English climate, of the prudent forethought of the English race, of their attachment to old possessions. Moreover, in his bluff British way, John Hammett was an orator. His speeches, quietly and earnestly delivered, contained those simple, sentimental clichés which are so deeply rooted in the English heart. Foreigners sometimes criticize them as both hypocritical and unbearably noble. John Hammett did not in the least mind being noble, in a sporting, public school, deprecating fashion. Moreover, he was a man of fine presence, tall, upstanding, with fair colouring and very bright blue eyes. His mother had been a Dane, and he himself had been for many years First Lord of the Admiralty, which gave rise to his nickname of the Viking. When at last ill health forced him to give up the reins of office, deep uneasiness was felt. Who would succeed him? The brilliant Lord Charles Delafield? Too brilliant. England didn't need brilliance. Evan Whitler? Clever, but perhaps a little unscrupulous. John Potter, the sort of man who might fancy himself as dictator. And we didn't want any dictators in this country, thank you very much. So a sigh of relief went up when the quiet Edward Ferrier assumed office. Ferrier was all right. He had been trained by the old man. He had married the old man's daughter. In the classic British phrase, Ferrier would carry on. Hercule Poirot studied the quiet, dark-faced man with the low, pleasant voice. Lean and dark and tired-looking. Edward Ferrier was saying, "Perhaps, Monsieur Poirot, you're acquainted with a weekly periodical called the X-Ray News." "I have glanced at it," admitted Poirot, blushing slightly. The Prime Minister said, "Then you know more or less of what it consists. Semi-libelous matter. Snappy paragraphs hinting at sensational secret history. Some of them true, some of them harmless, but all served up in a spicy manner. Occasionally—" He paused, and then said, his voice altering a little, "Occasionally, something more." Hercule Poirot did not speak. Ferrier went on. "For 2 weeks now, there have been hints of impending disclosures of a first-class scandal in the highest political circles. Astonishing revelations of corruption and jobbery." Hercule Poirot said, shrugging his shoulders, "A common trick. When the actual revelations come, they usually disappoint the cravers after sensation badly." Ferrier said dryly, "These will not disappoint them." Hercule Poirot asked, "Do you know, then, what these revelations are going to be?" With a fair amount of accuracy. Edward Ferrier paused a minute. Then he began speaking. Carefully, methodically, he outlined the story. It was not an edifying story. Accusations of shameless chicanery, of share juggling, of a gross misuse of party funds. The charges were levelled against the late Prime Minister John Hammett. They showed him to be a dishonest rascal, a gigantic confidence trickster, who had used his position to amass for himself a vast private fortune. The Prime Minister's quiet voice stopped at last. The Home Secretary groaned. He sputtered out, "It's monstrous! Monstrous! This fellow Perry, who edits the rag, ought to be shot." Hercule Poirot said, "These so-called revelations are to appear in the X-Ray News?" "Yes." "What steps do you propose to take about them?" Ferrier said slowly, "They constitute a private attack on John Hammett. It's open to him to sue the paper for libel." "Will he do that?" "No." "Why not?" Ferrier said, "It is probable that there is nothing the X-Ray News would like better. The publicity given them would be enormous. Their defence would be fair comment, and that the statements complained of were true. The whole business would be exhaustively held up to view in a blaze of limelight. Still, if the case went against them, the damages would be extremely heavy." Ferrier said slowly, "It might not go against them." "Why?" Sir George said primly, I really think that Edward Ferrier was already speaking. "Because what they intend to print is the truth." A groan burst from Sir George Conway. Outraged at such unparliamentary frankness, he cried out, "Edward, my dear fellow, we don't admit, surely—" The ghost of a smile passed over Edward Ferrier's tired face. He said, "Unfortunately, George, there are times when the stark truth has got to be told. This is one of them." Sir George exclaimed, "Look, you understand, Monsieur Poirot, that this is all strictly in confidence. Not one word—" Ferrier interrupted him. He said, "Monsieur Poirot understands that." He went on slowly. "What he may not understand is this. The whole future of the People's Party is at stake. John Hammett, Monsieur Poirot, was the People's Party. He stood for what it represents to the people of England. He stood for decency and honesty. No one has ever thought us brilliant. We have muddled and blundered. But we have stood for the tradition of doing one's best. And we have stood, too, for fundamental honesty. Our disaster is this, that the man who was our figurehead, the honest man of the people par excellence, turns out to have been one of the worst crooks of this generation. Another groan burst from Sir George. Poirot asked, "You knew nothing of all this?" Again the smile flashed across the weary face. Ferrier said, "You may not believe me, Monsieur Poirot, but, like everyone else, I was completely deceived. I never understood my wife's curious attitude of reserve towards her father. I understand it now. She knew his essential character." He paused and then said, "When the truth began to leak out, I was horrified, incredulous. We insisted on my father-in-law's resignation on the grounds of ill health, and we set to work to clean up the mess, shall I say." Sir George groaned. "The Augean Stables?" Poirot started. Ferrier said, "It will prove, I fear, too Herculean a task for us. Once the facts become public, there will be a wave of reaction all over the country. The government will fall. There will be a general election, and in all probability, Everard and his party will be returned to power. You know Everard's policy." The George spluttered. "A firebrand, a complete firebrand," Ferrier said gravely. "Everard has his ability, but he is reckless, belligerent, and utterly tactless. His supporters are inept and vacillating. It would be practically a dictatorship." Hercule Poirot nodded. Sir George bleated out, "If only the whole thing could be hushed up." Slowly the Premier shook his head. It was a movement of defeat. Poirot said, "You do not believe that it can be hushed up?" Ferrier said, "I sent for you, Monsieur Poirot, as a last hope. In my opinion, this business is too big. Too many people know about it for it to be successfully concealed. The only two methods open to us, which are, to put it bluntly, the use of force or the adoption of bribery, cannot really hope to succeed. The Home Secretary compared our troubles with the cleansing of the Augean Stables. It needs, Monsieur Poirot, the violence of a river in spate, the disruption of the great natural forces in nature. Nothing less, in fact, than a miracle. It needs, in fact, a Hercules," said Poirot, nodding his head with a pleased expression. He added, "My name, remember, is Hercule." Edward Ferrier said, "Can you perform miracles, Monsieur Poirot? It is why you sent for me, is it not? Because you thought that I might." "That is true. I realized that if salvation was to be achieved, it could only come through some fantastic and completely unorthodox suggestion." He paused for a minute. Then he said, "But perhaps, Monsieur Poirot, you take an ethical view of the situation. John Hammett was a crook. The legend of John Hammett must be exploded. Can one build an honest house on dishonest foundations? I do not know. But I do know that I want to try." He smiled with a sudden sharp bitterness. "The politician wants to remain in office, as usual, from the highest motives." Hercule Poirot rose. He said, "Monsieur, my experience in the police force has not perhaps allowed me to think very highly of politicians. If John Hammett were in office, I would not lift a finger. No, not a little finger. But I know something about you. I have been told, by a man who is really great, one of the greatest scientists and brains of the day, that you are a sound man. I will do what I can." He bowed and left the room. Sir George burst out, "Well, of all the damned cheek!" But Edward Ferrier, still smiling, said, "It was a compliment." On his way downstairs, Hercule Poirot was intercepted by a tall, fair-haired woman. She said, "Please, come into my sitting-room, Monsieur Poirot." He bowed and followed her. She shut the door, motioned him to a chair, and offered him a cigarette. She sat down opposite him. She said quietly, "You have just seen my husband. And he has told you about my father." Poirot looked at her with attention. He saw a tall woman, still handsome, with character and intelligence in her face. Mrs. Ferrier was a popular figure. As the wife of the Prime Minister, she naturally came in for a good share of the limelight. As the daughter of her father, her popularity was even greater. Dagmar Ferrier represented the popular ideal of English womanhood. She was a devoted wife, a fond mother. She shared her husband's love of country life. She interested herself in just those aspects of public life which were generally felt to be proper spheres of womanly activity. She dressed well, but never in an ostentatiously fashionable manner. She devoted much of her time and activity to large-scale charities. She had inaugurated special schemes for the relief of the wives of unemployed men. She was looked up to by the whole nation, and was a most valuable asset to the party. Hercule Poirot said, "You must be terribly worried, madame." "Oh, I am. You don't know how much. For years I have been dreading something." Poirot said, "You had no idea of what was going on, actually?" She shook her head. "No, not in the least. I only knew that my father was not what everyone thought him. I realized from the time that I was a child that he was a humbug." Her voice was deep and bitter. She said, "It is through marrying me that Edward will lose everything." Poirot said in a quiet voice, "Have you any enemies, madame?" She looked up at him, surprised. "Enemies? I don't think so." Poirot said thoughtfully, "I think you have." He went on, "Have you courage, madame? There is a great campaign afoot, against your husband, and against yourself. You must prepare to defend yourself." She cried, "But it doesn't matter about me, only about Edward." Poirot said, "The one includes the other. Remember, madame, you are Caesar's wife." He saw her colour ebb. She leaned forward. She said, "What is it you're trying to tell me?" Percy Perry, editor of the X-Ray News, sat behind his desk, smoking. He was a small man, with a face like a weasel. He was saying in a soft, oily voice, "We'll give him the dirt, all right. Lovely, lovely. Oh, boy." His second-in-command, a thin, spectacled youth, said uneasily, "You're not nervous?" "Expecting strong-arm stuff? Not them. Haven't got the nerve. Wouldn't do them any good either. Not the way we've got it farmed out. In this country, and on the continent, and America." The other said, "Well, they must be in a pretty good stew. Won't they do anything?" "They'll send someone to talk, pretty—" A buzzer sounded. Percy Perry picked up a receiver. He said, "Who'd you say? Right. Send him up." He put the receiver down and grinned. "They've got that high-toned Belgian dick onto it. He's coming up now to do his stuff. Wants to know if we'll play ball." Hercule Poirot came in. He was immaculately dressed, a white camellia in his buttonhole. Percy Perry said, "I'm pleased to meet you, Monsieur Poirot. On your way to the royal enclosure at Ascot? No? My mistake." Hercule Poirot said, "I am flattered. One hopes to present a good appearance. It is even more important." His eyes roamed innocently over the editor's face and somewhat slovenly attire. "When one has few natural advantages." Perry said shortly, "What do you want to see me about?" Poirot leaned forward, tapped him on the knee, and said with a beaming smile, "Blackmail." "What the devil do you mean, blackmail?" "I have heard. The little bird has told me that, on occasions, you have been on the point of publishing certain very damaging statements in your so spirituel paper. Then there has been a pleasant little increase in your bank balance, and after all, those statements have not been published." Poirot leaned back and nodded his head in a satisfied sort of way. Do you realize that what you're suggesting amounts to slander? Poirot smiled confidently. I am sure you will not take offence. I do take offence. As to blackmail, there is no evidence of my ever having blackmailed anybody. No, I am quite sure of that. You misunderstand me. I was not threatening you. I was leading up to a simple question. How much? I don't know what you're talking about, said Percy Perry. A matter of national importance, Monsieur Perry. They exchanged a significant glance. Percy Perry said, I'm a reformer, Monsieur Poirot. I want to see politics cleaned up. I'm opposed to corruption. Do you know what the state of politics is in this country? The Augean Stables. No more, no less. Tiens, said Hercule Poirot. You too use that phrase. And what is needed, went on the editor, to cleanse those stables is the great purifying flood of public opinion. Hercule Poirot got up. He said, I applaud your sentiments. He added, It is a pity that you do not feel in need of money. Percy Perry said hurriedly, Here, wait a sec, I didn't say that exactly. But Hercule Poirot had gone through the door. Everett Dashwood, the cheery young man on the staff of the branch, clapped Hercule Poirot affectionately on the back. He said, There's dirt and dirt, my boy. My dirt's clean dirt, that's all. I was not suggesting that you were on a par with Percy Perry. Damn little bloodsucker. He's a blot on our profession. We'd all down him if we could. It happens, said Hercule Poirot, that I am engaged at the moment on a little matter of clearing up a political scandal. Cleaning out the Augean Stables, eh? Said Dashwood. Too much for you, my boy. Only hope is to divert the Thames and wash away the Houses of Parliament. You are cynical, said Hercule Poirot, shaking his head. I know the world, that's all. Poirot said, You, I think, are just the man I seek. You have a reckless disposition. You are the good sport. You like something that is out of the usual. And granting all that, I have a little scheme to put into action. If my ideas are right, there is a sensational plot to unmask. That, my friend, shall be a scoop for your paper. Can do, said Dashwood cheerfully. It will concern a scurrilous plot against a woman. Better and better. Sex stuff always goes. Then sit down and listen. People were talking. In the Goose and Feathers at Little Wimplington. Well, I don't believe it. John Hammett, he was always an honest man, he was. Unlike some of these political folk. Well, that's what they say about all swindlers before they're found out. Thousands, they say, he made, out of that Palestine oil business. Just a crook deal it was. All of them tarred with the same brush. Dirty crooks, every one of them. You wouldn't find Everard doing that. He's one of the old school. But I can't believe as John Hammett was a wrong un. You can't believe all these papers say. Ferrier's wife was his daughter. Have you seen what it says about her? They pored over a much-thumbed copy of the X-ray News and read, Caesar's wife. We hear that a certain highly placed political lady was seen in very strange surroundings the other day, complete with her gigolo. Oh, Dagmar, how could you be so naughty? A rustic voice said slowly, Mrs. Ferrier's not that kind. Gigolo? That's one of those Dago skunks. Another voice said, You can never tell with women. The old bunch of 'em wrong-uns, if you ask me. People were talking. But, darling, I believe it's absolutely true. Naomi had it from Paul, and he had it from Andy. She's absolutely depraved. But she always was so terribly dowdy and proper. And opening bazaars, just camouflage, darling. They say she's a nymphomaniac. Well, I mean, it's all in the X-ray News. Not right out, but you can read between the lines. I don't know how they get hold of these things. What do you think of this political scandal touch? They say her father embezzled the party funds. People were talking. I don't like to think of it, and that's a fact, Mrs. Rogers. I mean, I always thought Mrs. Ferrier was a really nice woman. Do you think all these awful things are true? As I say, I don't like to think it of her. Why, she opened a bazaar at Polchester only last June. I was as near to her as I am to that sofa. and she had such a pleasant smile. "Yes, but what I say is there's no smoke without fire." "Well, of course, that's true. Oh, dear. It seems as though you can't believe in anyone." Edward Ferrier, his face white and strained, said to Poirot, "These attacks on my wife. They're scurrilous, absolutely scurrilous. I'm bringing an action against that vile rag." Hercule Poirot said, "I do not advise you to do so. But these damned lies have got to be stopped." "Are you sure they are lies?" "God damn you, yes." Poirot said, his head held a little on one side, "What does your wife say?" For a moment Ferrier looked taken aback. "She says it's best to take no notice. But I can't do that. Everybody's talking." Hercule Poirot said, "Yes, everybody is talking." And then came the small, bold announcement in all the papers. "Mrs. Ferrier has had a slight nervous breakdown. She has gone to Scotland to recuperate." Conjectures, rumours, positive information that Mrs. Ferrier was not in Scotland, had never been to Scotland. Stories, scandalous stories, of where Mrs. Ferrier really was. And again, people talking. "I tell you, Andy saw her at that frightful place. She was drunk or doped, with an awful Argentine gigolo. Ramon, you know." More talking. Mrs. Ferrier had gone off with an Argentine dancer. She had been seen in Paris, doped. She had been taking drugs for years. She drank like a fish. Slowly, the righteous mind of England, at first unbelieving, had hardened against Mrs. Ferrier. Seemed as though there must be something in it. That wasn't the sort of woman to be the Prime Minister's wife. A Jezebel. That's what she is. Nothing better than a Jezebel. Then came the camera records. Mrs. Ferrier, photographed in Paris, lying back in a nightclub, her arm twined familiarly over the shoulder of a dark, olive-skinned, vicious-looking young man. Other snapshots, half-naked on a beach, her head on the lounge lizard's shoulder, and underneath, "Mrs. Ferrier has a good time." 2 days later, an action for libel was brought against the X-ray News. The case for the prosecution was opened by Sir Mortimer Inglewood, K.C. He was dignified, and full of righteous indignation. Mrs. Ferrier was the victim of an infamous plot, a plot only to be equalled by the famous case of the Queen's Necklace, familiar to readers of Alexandre Dumas. That plot had been engineered to lower Queen Marie Antoinette in the eyes of the populace. This plot also had been engineered to discredit a noble and virtuous lady who was, in this country, in the position of Caesar's wife. Sir Mortimer spoke with bitter disparagement of fascists and communists, both of whom sought to undermine democracy by every unfair machination known. He then proceeded to call witnesses. The first was the Bishop of Northumbria. Dr. Henderson, the Bishop of Northumbria, was one of the best-known figures in the English Church, a man of great saintliness and integrity of character. He was broad-minded, tolerant, and a fine preacher. He was loved and revered by all who knew him. He went into the box and swore that between the dates mentioned, Mrs. Edward Ferrier had been staying in the palace with himself and his wife. Worn out by her activities in good works, she had been recommended a thorough rest. Her visit had been kept a secret, so as to obviate any worry from the press. An eminent doctor followed the bishop and deposed to having ordered Mrs. Ferrier to rest and complete absence from worry. A local general practitioner gave evidence to the effect that he had attended Mrs. Ferrier at the palace. The next witness called was Thelma Anderson. A thrill went round the court when she entered the witness box. Everyone realized at once what a strong resemblance the woman bore to Mrs. Edward Ferrier. "Your name is Thelma Anderson?" "Yes." "You are a Danish subject?" "Yes. Copenhagen is my home." "And you formerly worked at a cafe there?" "Yes, sir." "Please tell us in your own words what happened on the 18th of March last. There is a gentleman who comes to my table there, an English gentleman. He tells me he works for an English paper, the X-Ray News. You are sure he mentioned that name? The X-Ray News. Yes, I am sure. Because, you see, I think at first it must be a medical paper. But no, it seems not so. Then he tells me there is an English film actress who wants to find their stand-in, and that I am just the type. I do not go to the pictures much. I do not recognize the name, he says, but he tells me, yes, she is very famous, and that she has not been well, so she wants someone to appear as her in public places, and for that she will pay very much money. How much money did this gentleman offer you? £500 in English money. I do not at first believe. I think it is some trick. But he pays me at once half the money. So then I give in my notice where I work. The tale went on. She had been taken to Paris, supplied with smart clothes, and had been provided with an escort, a very nice Argentinian gentleman, very respectful, very polite. It was clear that the woman had thoroughly enjoyed herself. She had flown over to London, and had been taken there to certain nightclubs by her olive-skinned cavalier. She had been photographed in Paris with him. Some of the places to which she had gone were not, she admitted, quite nice. Indeed, they were not respectable, and some of the photographs taken, they too, had not been very nice. But these things, they had told her, were necessary for advertisement, and Signor Ramon himself had always been most respectful. In answer to questioning, she declared that the name of Mrs. Ferrier had never been mentioned, and that she had had no idea that it was that lady she was supposed to be understudying. She had meant no harm. She identified certain photographs which were shown to her as having been taken of her in Paris and on the Riviera. There was the hallmark of absolute honesty about Thelma Anderson. She was quite clearly a pleasant but slightly stupid woman. Her distress at the whole thing, now that she understood it, was patent to everyone. The defense was unconvincing. A frenzied denial of having had any dealings with the woman Anderson. The photos in question had been brought to the London office and had been believed to be genuine. Sir Mortimer's closing speech roused enthusiasm. He described the whole thing as a dastardly political plot, formed to discredit the Prime Minister and his wife. All sympathy would be extended to the unfortunate Mrs. Ferrier. The verdict, a foregone conclusion, was given amidst unparalleled scenes. Damages were assessed at an enormous figure. As Mrs. Ferrier and her husband and father left the court, they were greeted by the appreciative roars of a vast crowd. Edward Ferrier grasped Poirot warmly by the hand. He said, "I thank you, Monsieur Poirot, 1,000 times. Well, that finishes the X-Ray News. Dirty little rag. They're wiped out completely. Serves them right for cooking up such a scurrilous plot. Against Dagmar, too, the kindliest creature in the world. Thank goodness you managed to expose the whole thing for the wicked ramp it was. What put you onto the idea that they might be using a double?" "It is not a new idea," Poirot reminded him. "It was employed successfully in the case of Jeanne de la Motte, when she impersonated Marie Antoinette." "Why, no. I must reread The Queen's Necklace. But how did you actually find the woman they were employing?" "I looked for her in Denmark, and I found her there." "But why Denmark?" "Because Mrs. Ferrier's grandmother was a Dane, and she herself is a markedly Danish type. And there were other reasons. Well, the resemblance is certainly striking. What a devilish idea. I wonder how the little rat came to think of it." Poirot smiled. But he did not. He tapped himself on the chest. "I thought of it." Edward Ferrier stared. "I don't understand." "What do you mean?" Poirot said, "We must go back to an older story than that of the Queen's Necklace, to the cleansing of the Augean Stables. What Hercules used was a river, That is to say, one of the great forces of nature. Modernize that. What is a great force of nature? Sex, is it not? It is the sex angle that sells stories, that makes news. Give people a scandal allied to sex, and it appeals far more than any mere political chicanery or fraud. Eh bien, that was my task. First, to put my own hands in the mud like Hercules, to build up a dam that should turn the course of that river. A journalistic friend of mine aided me. He searched Denmark until he found a suitable person to attempt the impersonation. He approached her, casually mentioned the X-ray news to her, hoping she would remember it. She did. And so, what happened? Mud. A great deal of mud. Caesar's wife is bespattered with it. Far more interesting to everybody than any political scandal. And the result? The denouement? Why, reaction. Virtue vindicated. The pure woman cleared, a great tide of romance and sentiment sweeping through the Augean Stables. If all the newspapers in the country publish the news of John Hammett's defalcations now, no one will believe it. It will be put down as another political plot to discredit the government. Edward Ferrier took a deep breath. For a moment, Hercule Poirot came nearer to being physically assaulted than at any other time in his career. My wife! You dared to use her? Fortunately, perhaps, Mrs. Ferrier herself entered the room at this moment. "Now," she said, "that went off very well. Dagmar, did you know all along?" "Of course, dear," said Dagmar Ferrier. And she smiled, the gentle, maternal smile of a devoted wife. "And you never told me?" "But, Edward, you would never have let Monsieur Poirot do it." "Indeed I would not." Dagmar smiled. "That's what we thought." "We?" "I and Monsieur Poirot." She smiled at Hercule Poirot and at her husband. She added, "I had a very restful time with the dear bishop. I feel full of energy now. They want me to christen the new battleship at Liverpool next month. I think it would be a popular thing to do." End of The Labours of Hercules by Agatha Christie. Episode 5, The Augean Stables. Read by Beau McKenna.